The courtroom doors closed with a heavy echo as David Anderson stood alone at the defense table, his shoulders slightly hunched, hands folded so tightly that his knuckles had turned pale, a 46-year-old man whose face told a story long before his mouth ever opened, with deep lines carved by years of sleepless nights, loss, and quiet endurance. And as Judge Frank Caprio adjusted his glasses and looked down at the file before him, he paused longer than usual, not because the charges were complicated, but because something about the man standing there felt heavier than ink on paper. David Anderson had been cited for driving without insurance, expired registration, unpaid toll violations, and failure to comply with previous court orders, totaling fines exceeding $6,400, and on paper it looked like another routine case. But as the judge called his name and asked him to step forward, the silence in the room felt different, almost respectful, as if even the walls sensed that this was not just about money or traffic law, but about a life unraveling quietly in the shadows. Judge Caprio began gently, asking David how he wished to plead, and David's voice came out low and steady at first as he said, "Guilty, Your Honor," not with defiance or resignation, but with a strange honesty that made people look up. And when the judge asked if he wanted to explain the circumstances, David hesitated, swallowing hard, before nodding and beginning a story that unfolded slowly, like a wound being uncovered after years of silence. He explained that he had once been a licensed electrician, working steady jobs, paying taxes, raising a family, believing he was doing everything right, until the day his 16-year-old son, Ethan, was killed by a drunk driver while walking home from football practice, a moment that shattered his life into pieces so small he still hadn't found them all. And as he spoke, his hands began to shake, not theatrically, but uncontrollably, the kind of shaking that comes when pain lives too close to the surface for too long. David told the court that after Ethan's death, his wife fell into a deep depression, blaming herself for letting their son walk home that night, and within a year she left, not because she didn't love him, but because she couldn't stay in a house full of memories that felt like ghosts. And suddenly David was alone in a quiet home with an empty bedroom that still smelled faintly of teenage cologne and dreams that would never grow older. He continued working at first, trying to keep his life together, but grief is a heavy thing, and eventually it began to interfere with his concentration, leading to a serious workplace accident where he fell from a ladder, injuring his back and losing his job, and with no income, mounting medical bills, and a mind constantly replaying the last voicemail from his son, David began to fall behind on everything. First insurance payments, then registration, then court notices that he admitted he couldn't even bring himself to open because every envelope felt like another reminder that he was failing at surviving a life he never asked for. Judge Caprio listened without interrupting, his face serious but soft, the way it gets when he's not just hearing words but weighing a human soul. And when David finished speaking, the courtroom was silent except for the faint hum of the lights overhead, and the judge asked one simple question, "Sir, are you working now?" To which David replied that he worked part-time in a hardware store, earning just enough to keep food on the table and gas in the car, the same car he used to drive to visit his son's grave every Sunday morning, rain or shine, because it was the only place where he felt like he could still be a father. When asked how much money he had in savings, David answered honestly, "None, Your Honor." And when asked what would happen if the fines were enforced, his voice broke for the first time as he said that he would lose the car. And without the car, he would lose his job. And without the job, he wasn't sure he would have a reason to wake up anymore. The prosecutor, usually quick to argue procedure, remained unusually quiet, acknowledging that while the violations were real, the circumstances were extraordinary, and Judge Caprio leaned back in his chair, removing his glasses for a moment, a gesture familiar to those who had watched him long enough to know that a deeper decision was forming, and he spoke slowly, carefully, explaining that the law exists to maintain order, but justice exists to preserve dignity, and that courts must never forget the difference between someone who ignores the law out of disregard and someone who stumbles under the weight of life itself. He told David that grief does not come with an instruction manual, that pain has a way of stealing focus and energy, and that too often society punishes people not for wrongdoing, but for not healing fast enough. Judge Caprio then addressed the fines, stating that enforcing the full amount would serve no corrective purpose and would only push a grieving man further into despair, and he dismissed the failure to comply charge entirely, reduced the remaining fines to a nominal amount payable only if David's financial situation improved, and ordered the court clerk to connect him with a community assistance program for counseling and job retraining, emphasizing that asking for help is not weakness but survival. Then, in a moment that caused Quiet gasps throughout the courtroom. The judge reached into his pocket, placed money on the bench, and said that the court would consider the remaining balance paid, not as charity, but as an investment in a human being who still had value. And he reminded David that his son's life mattered, that his grief was valid, and that choosing to keep going, even when everything hurt, was an act of courage. David broke down completely then, covering his face as tears fell freely, not out of embarrassment but relief, the kind that comes when someone finally sees you not as a case number but as a person. And Judge Caprio waited patiently, allowing the moment to breathe, before delivering words that would stay with everyone present long after the courtroom emptied, telling David that being broken does not make you useless, that love does not end with death, and that honoring his son meant continuing to live in a way that reflected the values he tried to teach him. As David thanked the judge through sobs, the gallery wiped away tears, and even the bailiff looked down, blinking hard, and when the gavel finally came down, it felt less like the end of a case and more like the beginning of healing. David left the courtroom standing a little straighter than when he entered, not because his pain was gone, but because for the first time in years, someone in authority had told him that his life still mattered, and as Judge Caprio called the next case, the lesson lingered in the air like a quiet truth, that sometimes the greatest justice a court can deliver is compassion, and sometimes the law does not change a man's life, but understanding does. As David Anderson stepped away from the defense table, the courtroom clerk quietly announced that the judge had requested additional testimony, not because the case required it legally, but because something unfinished still lingered in the air, and Judge Caprio, sensing that David's story was only partially spoken, asked him to remain, gently explaining that sometimes the law moves too fast past the pain it creates, and today, the court would slow down. David looked confused, almost afraid, as if opening his heart any further might break what little strength he had left, but he nodded, because when a man has lost everything, honesty becomes the last thing he owns. Judge Caprio asked David to speak more about the months following his son's death, not as evidence, but as truth, and David took a deep breath before explaining how grief had changed him in ways he never expected, describing nights where sleep never came, mornings where getting out of bed felt like lifting concrete, and days where he sat in his car outside his own home because entering it meant facing silence louder than any noise. He told the court that he began missing small things first, appointments, paperwork, deadlines, and then bigger things like bills and notices, not because he didn't care, but because his mind was trapped in a moment he could not escape, replaying his son's laughter, his unfinished homework, and the jersey still hanging in the closet like a promise never fulfilled. At this point, Judge Caprio asked if anyone else wished to speak, and unexpectedly, a woman stood from the back row, hesitating before identifying herself as Maria Anderson, David's estranged wife, and the room shifted instantly, as no one had anticipated her presence. She explained softly that she had come not to defend or accuse, but because she had seen the court listing online and felt she owed the truth to the man who once carried her through the worst night of her life, admitting that she had left not because David failed as a husband, but because she failed to survive her own guilt, and that she had watched him slowly disappear under grief while blaming himself for everything that went wrong, even things beyond his control. Maria described how David used to wake up early every morning to make their son breakfast, how he never missed a school event, how he worked overtime so Ethan could attend football camps, and how the night of the accident, David had waited at the door long past midnight, knowing in his heart something was wrong, and when the police knocked, the man standing before the court today had died too, just not physically. Her voice broke as she said that David never asked for help, never complained, and never stopped loving his son, and that the violations listed on paper were not crimes of carelessness, but symptoms of a man drowning quietly. Judge Caprio listened intently, occasionally nodding, and then asked a question that cut deep. "Sir, did you ever receive counseling?" And David admitted that he tried once but stopped after 2 sessions because he felt guilty spending money on himself when his son no longer had a future to spend money on. A statement that caused an audible reaction in the courtroom, and the judge responded firmly that grief untreated does not disappear, it festers, and society often punishes people for wounds it refuses to see. He explained that mental pain is no less real than physical injury, and ignoring it does not make someone strong, it makes them invisible. The judge then addressed the legal side again, noting that while the court had discretion, accountability still mattered, but accountability did not have to mean destruction, and he ordered that David's record reflect mitigating life circumstances, a rare notation, ensuring that this case would not follow him like a shadow when applying for better work. He also instructed the clerk to pause all non-essential penalties for 6 months, giving David space to stabilize, and required not payment, but participation in counseling, community service mentoring young men, and reconnecting with purpose rather than punishment. What happened next would later be spoken about in whispers outside the courtroom, as Judge Caprio stood briefly, stepping down from the bench, and looked directly at David, telling him that courts are powerful places, but words spoken here must matter beyond these walls. And he told David that his son's legacy could not be pain alone, that it could be kindness, guidance, and survival, and that sometimes the bravest thing a father can do is keep living so his child's life continues through his actions. David nodded through tears, finally allowing himself to be seen not as a failure, but as a father still standing. As the hearing concluded, Maria approached David, and for the first time in years, they spoke without anger, without blame, just shared grief. And Judge Caprio quietly watched, knowing that justice had already been served before the gavel fell. When the courtroom emptied, those who had witnessed the case left changed, reminded that behind every citation is a story, behind every missed deadline is a struggle, and behind every man standing in court is a life shaped by love, loss, and the quiet hope that someone, somewhere, will listen. Judge Caprio allowed the courtroom to remain open a few minutes longer, not for legal necessity but for human truth, and as David Anderson stood there, exhausted yet strangely lighter, the judge asked a question that no statute ever requires but every heart eventually faces. "Sir, do you remember the last conversation you had with your son?" And the room seemed to hold its breath as David's eyes lifted slowly, filling with a distant pain that had lived inside him for years. Because some memories don't fade, they wait. David nodded, swallowing hard, and began to describe that final evening, the ordinary night that would later become the most extraordinary one of his life. He told the court that Ethan had been excited after football practice, talking non-stop about an upcoming game, joking about how sore his legs were, and asking his father if he could stop for a burger on the way home. And David smiled faintly as he recalled saying no because they had leftovers, a small decision that haunted him every day since, because grief has a cruel way of attaching itself to harmless moments. Ethan had hugged him before leaving the house, something teenage boys rarely do, and said, "I'll be quick, Dad," words that echoed endlessly in David's mind like a promise the universe chose not to keep. And when Ethan didn't return on time, David said he felt something shift inside him, a quiet panic that grew louder with every passing minute. David described waiting by the window, checking his phone, pacing the living room, convincing himself not to overreact, until the knock finally came. Not the familiar knock of a son who forgot his keys, but the heavy, hesitant knock of uniformed officers carrying a truth no parent should ever hear. He said he remembered every detail with brutal clarity: the rain on the sidewalk, the way one officer avoided eye contact, the exact moment his knees gave out when the words, "There's been an accident," were spoken, and the sound of his own voice screaming his son's name in a way that didn't even sound human. The courtroom sat frozen as David admitted that from that night forward, time stopped moving normally, days blurred into each other, and life became something he survived rather than lived. Judge Caprio listened intently, his expression tight with empathy, and asked David what he blamed himself for most, and David answered honestly that he blamed himself for everything: for letting Ethan walk home, for not insisting on driving him, for not hearing danger in his son's cheerful voice, and even for still being alive when his child was not. He said that guilt became his shadow, following him everywhere, whispering that every fine, every failure, every loss was punishment he deserved, and that over time, he stopped fighting it, allowing life to unravel because he believed he no longer had the right to a future. At this moment, Judge Caprio spoke firmly, his voice carrying a rare edge of authority mixed with compassion, explaining that guilt is a natural response to loss but a dangerous master if left unchecked, and that no loving parent causes tragedy by trusting their child, reminding David that responsibility belongs to the drunk driver who chose recklessness, not to a father who chose love. He emphasized that courts deal in accountability, but guilt without truth is injustice against oneself, and that David had been sentencing himself every day without trial, without defense, and without mercy. The judge then called attention to something subtle yet powerful, noting that despite everything, David still visited his son's grave every Sunday, still worked honestly when he could, still showed up to court instead of running, and still spoke with humility rather than anger, signs not of a broken man but of a man still anchored by love. He told the courtroom that resilience is not loud, it does not announce itself, It survives quietly, often unnoticed. And David's presence there was evidence of a strength he himself could not yet see. Maria, standing quietly nearby, began to cry openly as the judge addressed her as well, telling her that grief isolates people differently, and that leaving did not make her heartless, but staying disconnected forever would, encouraging both of them to understand that healing does not mean forgetting, it means learning how to carry loss without letting it crush the living. The courtroom felt less like a legal space and more like a place of reckoning, where pain was finally being acknowledged instead of punished. Judge Caprio prepared to close this portion of the hearing. He delivered words that would later be remembered as the soul of the case, telling David that his son's story did not end on a dark road, that it continued through every act of kindness, every young person he might guide, and every morning he chose to stand up instead of surrender, and that honoring the dead is not about suffering endlessly, but about living intentionally. David stood silently, tears streaming, not wiping them away, because for the first time, they were not tears of shame, but of release. The judge concluded by scheduling a follow-up review, not as a threat but as a promise, assuring David that the court would not disappear once the gavel fell, because justice does not abandon people after one good decision. And as the session adjourned, the energy in the room had changed completely, heavy but hopeful, broken but rebuilding, as if something long buried had finally been given permission to breathe. The courtroom reconvened weeks later, not because David Anderson had failed the court, but because the court had chosen not to fail him. And when David walked in this time, something about him was different, not healed, not whole, but steadier, as if the weight he carried was now balanced by purpose rather than guilt. Judge Caprio looked up and immediately noticed the change, the clean shirt, the clearer eyes, the posture of a man who had begun, slowly and painfully, to re-enter life, and he asked David how he had been since their last meeting, a simple question that opened a door David had long kept shut. David spoke honestly, saying that he had started counseling, that the first sessions were the hardest because they forced him to say his son's name out loud without breaking, but that each visit helped him understand something important, that grief does not demand punishment, it demands acknowledgement. He shared that through a court-recommended community program, he began mentoring teenage boys at a local youth center, kids who reminded him of Ethan, loud, hopeful, careless in the way only youth can be, and at first it hurt, but over time, it healed, because for the first time since the accident, his love had somewhere to go instead of nowhere to land. Judge Caprio asked about employment, and David explained that with assistance from the program, he had found steady work again as an electrician's assistant, slowly rebuilding his license, earning honestly, and most importantly, waking up each morning with a reason beyond survival. Maria was present again, sitting quietly, and when asked if she wished to speak, she stood and said that she and David had begun talking regularly, not about fixing the past, but about honoring it, visiting Ethan's grave together, and learning that shared grief could become shared strength instead of distance. And the courtroom listened, not as spectators, but as witnesses to something rare, the slow repair of a life once written. Offers broken. Judge Caprio then addressed the legal record, formally closing the case, confirming that all remaining fines were permanently dismissed, the violations resolved, and no further penalties would be imposed, stating clearly that the purpose of this court was never to crush a man already on his knees, but to help him stand again. And he reminded everyone present that the law must never become so rigid that it forgets who it was written for. He looked directly at David and told him that what happened to his son was a tragedy, but what happened afterward did not have to be a second one, and that choosing to live with intention was the most powerful verdict a father could deliver. Before ending the session, Judge Caprio said something that would echo long after the courtroom emptied, explaining that society often labels people by their worst moments, missed deadlines, unpaid fines, or quiet failures, without ever asking what storms they survived to get there, and that true. Justice is not measured by how much money is collected, but by how many lives are restored. He told David that his son's name would continue to live, not on a case file or headstone alone, but in every young life David touched, every lesson he passed on, and every morning he chose hope over surrender. David stood silently, tears in his eyes once more, but this time he smiled through them, thanking the judge not for mercy, but for dignity. And as he turned to leave, the courtroom audience rose. Instinctively, not ordered to, but moved to, a rare and spontaneous act of respect, and Judge Caprio brought the gavel down gently, closing the case not as a legal formality, but as a human conclusion. As David walked out into the sunlight, the world had not changed, the loss had not disappeared, But something inside him had shifted, and that was enough, because justice had done what punishment never could. It gave a grieving father permission to live again.